We're gonna take our time, slow down and design. Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be here. So we'll be talking about permaculture solutions to meet the challenges of climate change, and really it's about design for the Anthropocene. We can see these two pictures here of planet Earth. The one on the left is a satellite image taken in 1978, and the same part of the planet in 2012 is looking very different. Humans now are the major force that's changing the face of this planet. In 2008, I spent almost 6 weeks here in Cuba, working with the team here, visiting projects. It was really interesting, being in Cuba for the first time. I had this curious sense of, well, a foot in both worlds. There was this nostalgia for the childhood world that I grew up in the 1950s and early 60s, and yet at the same time feeling like I was seeing the future of post-collapse civilization. I learned a lot from that visit, and it challenged many of my perceptions and really brought home to me just how far we have to go in terms of living sustainably and living within our environmental or ecological footprint. I was born in 1951. The world I grew up in was a very different place. Life was simple. We had a sense of community. I think there was only 1 or 2 phones per neighbourhood. It was very exciting the day my mother brought home an electric toaster. Most of the appliances in our kitchen were hand appliances. We grew most of our food in the backyard. Most of our clothes were hand-me-downs from older cousins and neighbours, and if we wore anything new, we'd made it ourselves on an old treadle sewing machine. We darned our socks. Things like disposable tissues were unheard of. We used hankies. And that's a technology that we need to reintroduce, because if you've got 7 billion people using bits of forest and throwing it away every day, that's a lot of forest, isn't it? But we had fun, and there was a quality of life, and there was a sense of community that's seriously lacking in today's world. We talk a lot in permaculture about long-term planning and design for future generations. And the concept of 7 generations is often spoken of, and in many traditional societies, they would look carefully at introducing any change and what impact it might have in 7 generations' time. So I thought I'd look back 7 generations in my family. So I can definitely go back as far as my great-great-great-grandmother, who was born in 1800. And so we've got 7 generations from her through to my daughter, who is here with me today. What a different world my great-great-great-grandmother lived in. Even my grandmother, who's in the centre there, who was born in 1890, who was taken by her grandfather to see the very first aeroplane flown in Sydney. as a child. And then I remember in my early teen years sitting with my grandmother watching the first men walk on the moon. And all that had happened in her lifetime. The pace and rate of change is exponential. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to actually see even 2 generations ahead, let alone another 7. When I was born, there were only 2.5 billion people on this planet. Now there's 3 times as many, and still growing. So we've not only got exponential human population growth, we've got exponential growth of urbanisation, we've got the exponential growth of carbon emissions from fossil fuels, and the exponential use of energy. It was interesting yesterday, I was going through this presentation with my daughter Melian, and she said, "Oh look, you were born on the key line of the J curve." But, you know, so many of us are still obsessed with the energy techno fix fantasy. And I mean, really, is that the world that we're looking for? And are we going to replace the burning of fossil fuels with big solar farms like this that are sterilising our productive farmland? And there's limits. And we just do not want to recognise the limits. We want to continue on the way we are, but that is no option. One of Bill's favourite sayings was, "There's no such thing as a free lunch," and I often call it Mollison's law of thermodynamics. There's a price for everything. And we find that with each new technology, there is a legacy of unforeseen consequences that we have to deal with. Everything works both ways. There may be benefits, but we've also got to take off our rose-coloured glasses and see what the negatives are. And then we need to evaluate whether we really do need to go down that path, whether we really do need that so-called improvement, because everything is connected to everything else. Now, as our fossil fuels are depleting in terms of easily accessed oil reserves, and we're starting to see landscapes like this of fracking, so unconventional fuels and extracting gases from coal seams and shale seams. What is this doing to not only our farmland? And we're facing this almost everywhere now, not only in the States, but in Europe, in Australia. My own bioregion is threatened with this, and the contamination of our groundwaters and the depletion of water. I think it's been a rude shock, the whole Fukushima disaster, and nobody could foresee that huge tidal wave. And we're still dealing with the problem, a legacy that will be around for many thousands, if not millions of years. And the story isn't over yet. Our planet is literally drowning in waste. The legacy of our techno-industrial age. The image at the top there is from a New Scientist magazine in 2010. That is the space debris surrounding our planet. Our satellite technology. It is not sustainable. We're going to have peak space in space soon for this stuff. And yet, how much of our lives depend on this technology? We love our techno toys. And I mean, I really treasure this. It really helps me do a lot of work, but I do not see it as sustainable. It's a transition technology. And I've got to use it very wisely. And I've also got to be prepared for the day when I don't have that available. So I treasure things like my library, because I know my library will last long after these technologies die and I no longer have access to Google and the World Wide Web and all my PDF files. And I've just got two other images here to remind us of the amount of waste. I mean, our oceans are drowning in waste. The huge garbage patches in the Pacific, where there's more plastic than phytoplankton. The impact this is having on sea life. Plastics are forever. They don't break down. There is no such thing as a biodegradable plastic. They just break up into smaller and smaller pieces that then get eaten by smaller and smaller organisms. On the bottom right, we see also a well-intentioned mistake. Another one of Bill's sayings is, nothing so dangerous as a well-intentioned fool. And so in the UK, some years back, in an attempt to reduce fuel use, they had a program where people got subsidised to buy a new, more energy-efficient motor vehicle by handing in a perfectly good motor vehicle. So there's all these millions of vehicles. They're perfectly good. Many of them have still got 20, 30 years of use in them, and they're being trashed into scrap metal. It's criminal. And these represent huge quantities of embodied energy. And you have to drive a motor vehicle for at least 18 years to justify the embodied energy in it. If we want our vehicles to be more energy efficient, why don't we just have a carpool? And what's killing us is single-person motor cars. And as David Holmgren once said, you want to make your car twice as energy efficient? Take a passenger. So we've really got to reassess our definition of appropriate technology. And we've really got to look very seriously at the permaculture principle, produce no waste. So we're really getting to the heart of the third ethic of permaculture, the earth care, people care, and fair share. Now that third ethic has got two definitions. The first and most important one that a lot of people tend to forget is that we need to recognise limits to growth and consumption. And when we do generate a surplus, use it to support good earth care and people care, but that also means using that as a way to reduce our waste, to reduce our consumption. Inherent in this ethic of fair share is living within our ecological footprint. Now, if everybody on Earth lived like the average Cuban, we could sustain our current population with one planet. But if everybody on Earth, all 7 billion of us, wanted to live like Australians, we'd need 3.7 planets. Or like an American, we'd need another 2. Problem is, we've only got 1. Now, the reality of this is, as an Australian, we have to reduce our consumption by 70%. 70%. Americans need to reduce their consumption by 80%. Now that hurts, doesn't it? It makes us feel very uncomfortable, but we need to feel uncomfortable because it's nothing compared to the discomfort we're going to face in another 10, 20, 30 years' time. Forget about the end of the century. This is the critical decade. It's what we do between now and 2020 that is going to largely determine the planet that exists at the end of this century. This is our last chance. Our current path with business as usual is still on this manic trajectory, which is guaranteeing by end of century an increase of 5 degrees, possibly 7 degrees. Now the planet hasn't experienced temperatures like that for over 4 million years. Most of the life forms that we share this planet with couldn't survive in a planet of those temperatures. So we are on track for the extinction of our species and most of the ones that we share this planet with. That is the reality. If we look at the most ambitious pledges that our governments are making, and if they stick to them and they don't fudge it with shonky trading schemes, we're looking at 3.5 degrees increase in global temperature. If we really want to cap the temperature increase at 2 degrees by end of this century, we've actually got to contract right down. That's the minimum contraction for a 2-degree increase. And that's not certain. We really need to be looking at that lower line to make it a certainty. So we have this massive emissions gap that we've got to deal with, and we've got to deal with it fast. We need to radically decarbon the atmosphere. And, you know, it doesn't help ignoring the problem. We're really good at ignoring problems, and there's this sort of new ageisms that, oh, you know, if you talk about bad stuff, you're just going to manifest it. So, if we don't talk about rape and murder, they're going to stop? No. We've got to tackle this head on. We've got to talk about the uncomfortable truths. Otherwise, people are still going to be living in their little fantasy bubbles that everything's going to be okay and some magic free energy is going to turn up and we'll be right. Unfortunately, the laws of physics and chemistry are not negotiable. So really, what we are designing for is climate catastrophe. And I'm not going to be gentle about it. That is the reality. And it feels very uncomfortable. When you look at the science, if you're brave enough to follow the science, it is incredibly depressing. But then, you know, when I also look around and I see so many amazing people doing so many amazing things and being part of the solutions, I still harbour a glimmer of hope, and we need to nurture that candle of hope. But just looking at our recent thresholds, last year in 2012, the Arctic ice was at its lowest in 120,000 years. Last year we had the greatest emissions. We broke the record despite all the talks and all the conferences and all the pseudo-agreements. We emitted more carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxides last year than any previous year. This year, in May, the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere hit 400 parts per million, the highest in 4 million years. Get a grip on it. We're constantly breaking new records for heat, for drought, for cyclones. That red map there of Australia, the Bureau of Meteorology had to actually add 2 new colours to that when we had our heat waves in January, when parts of South Australia went up to 57 degrees. Is there anybody here under 30? Wow, under 29. Well, you have never experienced a normal climate. October this year was the 344th consecutive month that the Earth had an above average temperature. That's 29 years. So it's imperative that we apply self-regulation and accept feedback, no matter how uncomfortable it is. So, yeah, climate chaos. We need to design for increasing occurrence and severity of extreme weather events, drought and fire and floods and extreme storm events, ocean level rise, temperature extremes, cyclones, tornadoes, hurricanes. We need to pull communities together. We need to plan our disaster response and preparation. And there's been some good things already put forward, and I think as permaculturists we've really got to seriously address this. There are people doing excellent work in this field, and I really want to acknowledge the work of EDEP, the Indonesian permaculture NGO, who have written community disaster management manuals, videos, comic books, doing training, getting there on first response after tsunamis, after civil unrest, riots, and those human disasters, as well as volcanoes and so forth. We've got to work on the community level and design resilience for survival. And we can only do that as communities, and that's where social permaculture comes in. Because to work with people, we need our social systems, our social strategies, our tools as facilitators. So we've got to work together to develop our food and water security, to survive the impacts of economic collapse, because it's inevitable, of civil unrest, of industrial catastrophe like nuclear and chemical, of political instability, of energy and fuel crises and shocks, and technology failure. So while we're building resilience, we need to be mitigating the triggers of climate change. We need to be reducing our emissions, and we need to be sequestering carbon, decarbonising the atmosphere. So with emissions reduction, we need to wean ourselves off our fossil fuel dependence, and we need to do it fast. We need to exercise frugality. It's not a dirty word. It's got to become an honourable thing to do, and reduce our consumption. We need to eliminate waste. We need to repurpose and reuse all the materials and the resources that we've already got in circulation. We need to conserve energy and resources. We need to relocalise things back to a human scale so we can access our needs with our feet by walking, so we don't need our motor vehicles anymore. And as I've already said, redefine what is appropriate technology. With carbon sequestration, it's not geoengineering we're talking about. In permaculture, we're talking about bioengineering, using natural biological systems to draw down and capture that carbon. And we do that through forest conservation, through reforestation, through land regeneration, rehabilitating our soils, increasing and restoring the organic matter, using biochar, holistic management systems, and contracting back from industrial agriculture to small-scale, diverse food production systems. So we need to catch and store energy and use and value our renewable resources and services. When we look at the global carbon cycle, we find that 82% of terrestrial carbon is in the soil. The oceans have given us a huge buffer, and we're actually living in a little bit of a fantasy world in terms of the impacts of climate change, because over the past 50 to 100 years, the ocean have absorbed 90% of the extra heat generated by our emissions, and they have drawn down and sequestered 50% of the CO2, but they are nearing saturation level. So very soon we are going to really see things changing fast. Industrial agriculture, factory food, factory vegetables, factory grains, factory animals are responsible for 33% of all human greenhouse gases. We hear a lot of people talking about factory animal farming, but we don't hear many people talking about factory vegetable farming. This photo here is of greenhouses in Spain growing vegetables. Look at all the embodied energy there. Look at all the eventual waste in those systems. That is shocking. So globally, agriculture is responsible for 25% of our CO2 emissions, 60% of our methane emissions, and 80% of nitrous oxide. Methane and nitrous oxide are incredibly potent greenhouse gases. 90% of the energy used in agriculture is for making nitrogen fertilizers, for fueling our farm machinery, and for pumping water for irrigation. To produce 1 tonne of grains or vegetables in modern agriculture uses 6 to 10 times more energy than small-scale sustainable farming systems. So we've really got to contract back, we've got to power down, we've got to downscale. Which brings us back to the soil. A hectare of healthy soil in the top 10 to 15 centimetres, 4 to 6 inches, can hold 450 tonnes of organic matter, which contains 320 tonnes of carbon atoms, which originated from 1,200 tonnes of atmospheric CO2. It's estimated that an increase of 1.6% soil organic matter on croplands globally could sequester all our excess atmospheric carbon dioxide. Wow. Wow. We need an agricultural revolution, don't we? So 38%, a few years, a couple of decades ago it was 30%, now it's 38% of global land area is agricultural land. 12% of that is suitable for plant production. 26% is covered by grasses and shrubs that can only be digested by ruminants who can turn it into digestible proteins for human consumption. Much of that grass and shrub land that's used for grazing is not suitable for cropping. If you start growing soybeans and stuff on there, you'll turn it into a desert real fast. So we need to look really carefully at how we're managing these landscapes and producing our food. Now, with that little 12% of cropland, and a big proportion of that is used for grain production, 50% of our global grain harvest is used for animal feed. Animals that weren't designed to eat grains, but to eat grasses and cellulose. These feedlot systems are producing 30% of our global methane emissions. But what people don't talk about much is that rice cultivation in wetland paddies is producing nearly half as much methane as these animal systems. Everybody's really willing to talk about the evils of eating meat, but nobody talks about the evils of eating rice. There's been some very interesting work which turns a lot of assumptions upside down. And one of the pioneers here is Dr. Christine Jones, an Australian scientist. She says, soil represents the largest carbon sink over which we have control. Improvements in soil carbon levels could be made in all rural areas, whereas the regions suited to carbon sequestration in plantation timbers are limited. Did you know that 1 acre of well sustainably managed pasture can sequester more carbon in a year than an acre of forest? Whoops! So yes, forests are important. We do need to reforest. We need to create food forests and ecosystem service forests. But we must not overlook the incredible potential of 26% of our agricultural land to sequester massive amounts of carbon. Now, these grazing lands can also grow our crops. And this is one of the great innovations of Christine Jones. She is doing pasture cropping. So in sustainably managed rotational pasture systems, going in and putting in a winter grain crop, just direct seeding it with no ploughing, getting incredible results and beautiful build-up of carbon and organic matter in the soil. So we need to open our vision in terms of how we can obtain a yield and design from patterns to detail. There's not enough being talked about in terms of the potential of regenerative livestock production. There's no natural ecosystem in the planet without animals, and yet we're creating all these plant-based production systems which are devoid of animals. We've got to reintegrate the plant and the animal systems, and then real magic can happen. Some recent studies on silvopasture, which is a concept that permaculture has been promoting for 30 years, of incorporating trees and shrubs with our pasture systems. A recent study in Colombia where they included just one species, Lucina, and I mean, as permaculturists, we can do a lot better than that, but including Lucina in pasture yielded 64% more protein in the feed for the animals and resulted in a 15% increase in milk. Now, what's interesting is with these integrated systems, the plants are sequestering more carbon than the animals are emitting. So we can have our food and we can be sequestering vast amounts of carbon at the same time while regenerating our landscapes. Many of these landscapes, are marginal. So we need to use the edges and value the marginal. Incorporate livestock with our food forests and our fruit production, as well as introducing fodder and fibre and fuel trees into our grazing systems. Much of the land, agricultural land of the earth, is what we call brittle landscapes, particularly the subtropics and warm temperate regions of the earth, where if you go in there with the plough, you'll create a desert in no time at all. If you don't manage livestock sustainably, you'll also create a desert. And if you remove the animals from the system, you'll get rampant desertification. It was interesting, I picked up a New Scientist to read on my flight on my way here. And the cover story was, what would the planet look like if humans didn't exist? With the hypothetical that, what if there was some huge catastrophe that wiped us all out? Back in Africa, 20,000 years ago. And a lot of the planet would actually be massive grasslands and savannas supported with huge herds of animals. People like Alan Savory have observed the natural systems of rangelands and developed, managed systems to actually regenerate the land. We can regenerate the land using the animals and their ecosystem services. So we need to observe and interact. Small-scale integrated plant and animal production systems have the greatest capacity for soil carbon sequestration. Some research by the Rodale Institute trialling comparative farming systems over 21 years found that manure-based organic food production sequestered almost twice as much carbon as a legume-based organic production systems. So let's bring the animals back into the system, out of the factories and the feedlots, back to where they belong. We need to integrate rather than segregate and use and value diversity. Our smaller livestock, like pigs and poultry and rabbits and so on, can be raised on our food waste and crop residues and byproducts that aren't suitable for human consumption. We shouldn't be growing grains to feed them. 1/3 of our global food product is wasted in the production on the farm, through processing, through retail systems, and by the consumer. In Australia and the UK, 40% of the food people buy ends up in the trash can. In the US, it's more like 50%. So how do we get this waste back into the production system instead of the waste stream? Well, I saw a really lovely example when I visited Cuba in 2008. And I think Nelson's here. Where are you, Nelson? I saw him walking around there before, yes. And he's got a rabbit farm on his rooftop here in Havanna. I don't know how many rabbits he's actually got there, but he told me that he actually raised 364 baby rabbits in a year. Now, that's a lot of food. And the main feed is dehydrated food waste collected from his neighbours, supplemented by foraging a few weeds. So we can get, really interesting production systems happening on a small scale. So don't forget the power of small and slow solutions, especially when we multiply them by hundreds of rooftops. There's just numerous wonderful examples of, excellent regenerative systems and processes. There's another permaculture property, sustainable property in southern New South Wales. But in my last few minutes, I'd like to welcome you to my bioregion and some of the initiatives that we're doing there to creatively use and respond to change. This is my place, Janbun Gardens. That's what the place looked like in 1993. An empty, degraded, compacted cow pasture. That's what it looks like now. So we've created here a place to teach permaculture. It's a living landscape, a living classroom to bridge the gap between theory and practice and inspire people to make a difference. We grow a lot of our own food, and actually 90% of our total diet is sourced within a 100-kilometre radius, including our coffee. We minimise our reliance on power tools. And I love my hand tools, and these can last for generations if you take care of them. One of the axes in that photograph there belonged to my grandfather, and he was given it by his father. So good tools, you look after them, they can last a long time. That's a good use of that embodied energy, hey? I've got a 2-pig powered tractor. And you can see, they can really plough and turn the soil over, can't they? And they have a wonderful time doing it. And they also recycle our waste and turn it into manure for our compost, for our vegetable gardens. And we get a fantastic harvest from these systems. So we need to really look again at the potential of animal power and let the animals have fun doing what they want to do and love to do and doing the work for us. Our main crop, though, is education. Farming people, gardening people. And so we have a whole range of courses, and I hope during the convergence to have time to share a little more with you about some of the courses and the longer-term training we conduct there, and training the next generation of professional permaculturists and activists and agents of change. We're 100% self-reliant in water through our roof rainwater tanks and our dams and ponds. We have composting toilets. We treat all our wastewater and recycle it on site. We grow all our own firewood. We've got loads of bamboo, and we need to set up a serious biochar kiln so we can turn the waste of that, our waste bamboo, into biochar for the garden and all the other things that you can use biochar for. We generate 80% of our electricity with solar, but I see that as an interim and not a long-term sustainable solution. Our community has been in transition since the early 70s. Nimbin is a hotspot for alternatives and appropriate technologies and organics, and there's a lot of old hippies hanging around there and young ones, and it's a very exciting community to be a part of. In recent years, we've set up a community solar farm and had a collective solar purchase group with grid interactive solar arrays on rooftops throughout the village and in the whole valley. And so now on a sunny day, 75% of the electricity comes from the sun for the entire village and for 3,000 surrounding rural households. We don't have to wait for governments to make the changes. We can make them ourselves if we come together as communities. We do fun things as well. I mean, downscaling can be such fun. We have clothes swap stays in the community hall, and as fundraisers for things like the preschool, and we have a ball. There's always people playing lots of music, and there's drinks and cakes available, and lots of theatre and drama, and people doing impromptu fashion parades with all sorts of amazing combinations of clothing. So it's really important we get the fun factor in there and the conviviality. Celebrate our humanity. Within our bioregion, we've got just about every skill we need for survival, including a blacksmith. That's an important one. We have our Nimbin Food Security Group, and Robyn and McCurdy also did some workshops with the group in the early days, and it's really powering. We've got something like 20 farmers markets that are happening in our greater bioregion, including in Nimbin. We've got local cheeses, coffee, olives, olive oil, macadamias, all sorts of fruit and vegetables, wines. I mean, you name it, we've got it. We've got our local rice, pecans. This is our local rice, dryland rice farmer. And so there are solutions. You can have rice without feeling guilty. Just grow dryland varieties. Anywhere with a good summer rainfall can grow dryland rice. And he uses a yeoman's plough or actually it's an agro plough for direct seeding his rice into the pasture, and there's lots of really good people doing great solutions out there. He is doing it only for local consumption, and just by selling his rice through a few local shops and at the local markets, he earns his income, whereas previously he had to work off farm 2 days a week to make ends meet. With the farmers market and the growth of the local food movement, our local farmers are now becoming sustainable. We've got our local biodynamic grain grower, and so the local Nimbin bakery actually gets their grains from him, the spelt and so forth, grinds it up in the Nimbin community flour mill, and we get wonderful spelt bread with sourdough. And so all these things are happening in our bioregion. It is possible. And, I think if there's collapse, I just couldn't think of a better place to be than in my bioregion. And, my students, this is James, who did the Certificate 3 in permaculture with us, and he set up a wonderful permaculture farm producing subtropical fruits and honey and organic vegetables, which he markets through the local farmers markets. As a community, though, we also need to meet threats to our sustainability, to our environment. We have a huge threat at the moment with coal seam gas, and we have a conservative state government and a conservative national government which really wants to promote this disastrous form of fuel extraction. So we already had a few big battles last year. There's more battles ahead. But our community has a track record. The first ever major environmental blockade was by our community to save the rainforests of Terania Creek, which are now World Heritage listed subtropical rainforests. So I live in a community that has 30 years experience in non-violent action to preserve our environment and the treasures that we appreciate so much. Just in closing, I just want to quote something from Bill. He said, "While the problems are incredibly complex, the solutions are embarrassingly simple." So get out there and do it.
So you've been emphasizing the need for carbon sequestration, but historically, as far as I understand it, every time that there's been a massive sequestration, we've had a mini ice age. So I'm wondering if you think that we'll have to design systems that will then be resilient for those kind of disasters.
I don't think we've got a risk of a mini ice age. I mean, the Earth actually should be working towards an ice age. Our ice caps should be growing. We are facing such an exponential rise in temperatures. We need that kind of rapid contraction of temperature, otherwise there's no survival. So it's that history of massive sequestration that's triggered ice ages when there's been normal climate that actually gives us hope that if we do it fast enough, we've got a chance.
Hi, thanks for a wonderful talk and very inspiring to hear about what's going on in your area. I just would ask if you would like to make a comment on this. I'm part of a team of researchers at Newcastle University in Australia, and we've been doing a lot of work on looking at the community attitudes to environmental issues and climate change and the environmental crisis. And what we found is something that I think some environmentalists probably would be a bit surprised by, which is that the community at large is very aware of environmental problems. And if you ask them questions like, how do you foresee the future in 50 years, huge majorities, like 80 to 90%, will say they foresee some kind of ecological disaster. At the same time, what we've found, and this is also reflected in research in Norway, is that what we call two-track thinking. So while they think this in one track of their head, in another track of their head they go on as business as usual. You know, like young people will talk about how the world is going to end with a huge environmental crisis, and then, you know, 5 minutes later in the interview they'll start talking about how they're going to go to Europe after they've been to uni, flying a plane of course, and then they're going to have 3 kids and have a large house and a beautiful car and so on. Have you any comments on how permaculture can kind of break through this sort of socially organised denial of climate change?
Yes, that's a big question and a really important one, and one I keep asking myself all the time. How do we get through that disconnect? You know, that disconnect, because our brains are sort of really wired to business as usual. And I don't know, is it going to take an economic collapse for people to actually contract? It's very hard to envisage people voluntarily taking the measures that they need to in terms of reducing their consumption. Unless it's social pressure. You know, if we can get this thinking going viral, people will respond very quickly to social pressure. I mean, we've seen huge changes in people's behavioural patterns with recycling, for example, in Australia. And there's hardly a municipality that doesn't recycle. And people almost feel embarrassed to put something recyclable into a trash can now. We've seen, you know, a huge shift in thinking with things like smoking. And so we need to get a massive shift with people's thinking, but we need the media on side. We need the media on side. We need to get info, entertainment happening of solutions. Maybe we need permaculture reality TV shows or something, yeah? And look, can I just have 2 minutes of your time to show something which is part of this, which I wanted to just end up on. This is one of my students who's, oh, no, it didn't happen. Oh, no, oh dear. All right, sorry. If there's time at the end of question time, I'd like to just play you a very short video of one of my students' songs. He's written songs for the 12 permaculture principles, and that's one of the ways we can get that message out there, is through fun, through music, through culture. So we've got to get the culture back into the perma, and that will really help get that message through. Okay. All right, I'll just have to go into Finder. I thought I'd queued it, but probably on the one that, okay. You can never find things when you're in a hurry. No such thing as waste. Here we go. Yeah. Yeah, so Charlie did his Certificate 3 in permaculture with us 2 years ago. And one of the assignments was to give a presentation on a permaculture principle. And I challenged everybody to bring a creative element into their presentations, you know, because I'm very passionate about getting the culture into the perma. So this is what he came up with. Oh, where's the sound?
What is your sound?
My sound's
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I like to catch the rain while everybody in my town watched it flow right down. When I was a little boy, I liked to catch the rain while everybody in my town watched it flow right down the drain. 'Cause in our little shed in the bush, we wasn't on the mains. The only water we had to use was in a tank got from the rain. 'Cause there's no such thing as waste, only stuff in the wrong place. No, there's no such thing as waste. Misusing water's a disgrace. Moved to the city, rented a house on my way to buy a bed. Saw one lying on the side of the road, so I took that one instead. And also found a Frigid couch and a big old plasma screen, and the biggest pile of thrown out stuff that I had ever seen. But there's no such thing as waste, oh no, only stuff in the wrong place, yeah. I said there's no such thing as waste. That old landfill is a disgrace. Down the track, I found out that diesel cars can run on veggie fat. I bought a truck and hit the road, smelling like fish and chips. I rescued piles of wasted oil from the back of restaurants. I said I'd be a fool if I bought my fuel, and there's all nobody wants. 'Cause there's no such thing as waste, oh no, only stuff in the wrong place, yeah. Oh yeah, there's no such thing as waste. Them fossil fuels is a disgrace. Now we gotta refuse, reduce, reuse, repair, recycle. Refuse, reduce, reuse, repair, recycle. Now a dumpster dive to stay alive. I compost every crumb. I save my seeds and eat my weeds and feed the leftovers to your mum. Gonna build a house from the rubbish tip. Gonna keep this planet clean. Gonna use ideas that have been around for years to live within its means. 'Cause there's no such thing as waste, oh no,